Please state your name where you're from and your occupation.
Well, I'm Rudy Phillips. I'm from South Africa. I teach in Malaysia. So I'm a teacher in Malaysia. I teach primary school.
My name is Kathy Pryor. I live in Malaysia. I'm from South Africa. I actually don't have a South African passport. I have a British passport. And I am unemployed. I am not permitted to work in Malaysia.
My name is Adila Yusuf. I am from the Republic of South Africa. And I am a chartered accountant by profession, but not working at this moment in time, taking a career break to spend some time with my kids.
My name is Soraya Adam. I'm from Pretoria in South Africa, and I am an attorney by profession. I currently work as a project manager.
How would you define poverty?
Poverty is basically just a lack of money. It's being extremely poor. Not just money, I suppose, but being denied just good quality of life just because you can't afford it. That's poverty.
I would say poverty is really the ability of a family or a person to not be able to provide themselves with the basic necessities of life, being water, sanitation, food, and maybe a roof over their heads. Yeah.
I think poverty is something you can talk about it for a while, but if you have to define it in a nutshell, poverty to me would mean the inability of an individual or a state at large to provide for basic living necessities. And when I say basic living necessities, I'm talking about food and shelter. And yes, there are other necessities such as clothing, but you can, those are endearing objects that you can buy once off and use. But food and shelter is something that you have a constant need for. And if you are unable to provide for food and shelter from the income that you earn, then I would define that as living in poverty.
Poverty, in my view, is a situation where a person cannot afford to pay for their basic needs. For example, the basic requirements to keep them alive, like food and shelter. They are not able to afford even those basic things to keep them alive and healthy.
Yeah.
What does inequality mean to you?
Inequality, I think it's different when it comes to other countries as well as compared to South Africa. Obviously, inequality means unequal, but in South Africa, it takes on a little more, it takes on a different meaning or just a different definition as compared to how it is in other countries, because the inequality gap in South Africa is so big that you can't really even just call it inequality. It's something totally different. It's a crime basically. But yeah, inequality is not having the same opportunities as others.
It's such a tough one, especially when you're talking about South Africa, because I haven't lived in South Africa for 10 years. So it's difficult for me to know, exactly what is going on there when you haven't lived there. But I would say inequality is really, South Africa has such a very high unemployment rate. So the inequality is the people who are not able to provide for themselves against the people who obviously can provide for themselves. And in South Africa, there are so many factors making that a possible or not possible thing. Yeah. So inequality, similar to poverty, but just inequality, you do have the two sides, those who can and those who cannot.
So I think the word inequality is a broad word and it can mean many things. You have to be specific as to what you're relating to. It can be gender inequality, religious inequality, racial inequality. But I know based on the questions from the first question about poverty, this is more talking about socio-economic inequality. So in that regard, it is the unfair distribution of wealth, of state wealth or communal wealth between the individuals that reside within that region or community. So favoring one class or sect of people over another and doing it in an unfair manner where the people at the top end of the spectrum are extravagantly well off and the people at the bottom end of the spectrum are impoverished. And as a result, lack basic humanitarian needs such as food, shelter, sanitation, etc. Yeah.
Inequality can mean many things to many people. It, in my view, it relates to a situation where there are huge differences in levels of huge differences in, it could either be in a political system or in a social system, where basically there are huge differences in what is available to different sectors in the population. To give you an example, in South Africa, prior to 1994, I'm sure you are aware that there was a legislated state of apartheid in South Africa, and that whole policy was a policy of inequality. It drew a distinction between different population groups in South Africa and gave certain privileges and rights to one sector of the population, but there was a large sector of the population which was excluded from that, and that is an example of inequality within a political system, which then has wider ramifications like social inequality, socioeconomic inequalities after that. So that's one example of inequality where there's different treatment of different people of the same construct.
Would you agree that poverty and inequality are correlated issues?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, can't disagree with that. Yeah.
Very much so. Very much so. Yeah. Sure. Have you been to South Africa?
No, not.
No, you just picked it. Okay. Unfortunately, in South Africa, for me, education is very vital, and so many South Africans don't have they have access, but it's not easy access. You know, you'll hear stories of people walking 20 kilometers every day just to get to school. It's not easily available, and then when that schooling is available, it's most probably not of a good standard. So not everybody has access to education, which then makes it a very difficult thing. You know, if people don't have basic education, how do you better yourselves in life?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's such a basic thing, but for so many people, they don't have it. Or they have, you know, they'll go to school for grade 1 and grade 2 and then not be able to go to school again because they are, through circumstances, forced to look after granny, children, family, mother, father, and so they're not getting any further education. So, yeah, I'd say the two of them are, if you don't have the education, it's very hard to step out of the poverty.
I think they are two separate issues, but they can be correlated very easily. There are some certain countries which there might not be any religious inequality, racial inequality between the people, but they are, as a country, poor in terms of not furthering their economies. But in certain countries, especially in South Africa, which is a subject matter here, poverty and equality in this instance is very much linked together, because the masses of South Africa, which are the Black population, the Black native population, they're the ones that have been subject to very unfair circumstances and inequality, socio-economic inequality, and they are deeply impoverished. Standards of living with them are very low. So their poverty did stem from inequality. So in that regard, yes, it can be closely related.
Yes, I would agree to the extent that where one sector of the population is deprived of access to certain opportunities, access to finance, access to education, all of those things have an impact on whether or not a person can actually make progress and can be, and that progress can be on an equal footing with someone who may have access to all of those opportunities. So once again, to bring it back to the South African context, where almost 95% of the population prior to 1994 actually did not have access to a decent job opportunities, to a decent standard of education, to housing, to finance, to health, to a equitable healthcare system. All of that has a huge impact, and you have only to look at the history of slavery throughout the world and look at how that has impacted on the development of communities who are the descendants of slaves. If you look at in the US, for example, countries in the Caribbean like Haiti and all those countries where they are the descendants of slaves. If you look at South America as well, or any countries where they have had a history of slavery, those communities have been the most oppressed, and it has been the most difficult for those communities to escape from poverty.
From your perspective, how do you view income inequality in South Africa?
The income gap in South Africa is huge. When you look at the rich and the very poor, we've got both extremes. I think South Africa is the most unequal country in the world when it comes to what people have, and the gap is widening, I think, just because of the economy. But I think it all stems from apartheid, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to put right, even after the 20-some odd years that we've been free. It's still very, very difficult. Still a long way to go to redistribute the wealth the way it should be.
The unemployment in South Africa is the people that, you know, every government has a a basic line that people can live on that kind. And I think about 50% of, or just under 50% of South Africa's population live under the breadline. And, you know, that's a huge amount.
Yeah.
How do you raise those people's standards and expectations? I would say the government is partly responsible. The government have to provide some sort of jobs on a big scale. You know, they have to, whether it's building roads or new schools or things like that, that provide mass employment for people, because then that will lift a huge amount of people, will give them jobs which will lift them above the poverty line. I don't know, living here, you really are in so many ways a first world country in Malaysia, where everybody strives for better, and you can get better, but when in South Africa, when you haven't had the education, how do you better yourself?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's really hard. So I'd say income and poverty are definitely correlated. Yeah.
So this one, I just had to read up a little bit about it because I have my opinion, but I want to know factually what's really happening. And I have to say, I was extremely, as a South African person, extremely surprised or shocked by the statistics that I actually read about. So I read an article by a statistics essay, which was, I think, relevant. So probably issued in September 2020, so a couple months ago, stating that, and I largely knew this, but I didn't know the extent to which it related to. The article stated that 20% of the income earners in South Africa earn 65% of the income of the total income of the country, and 80% of the country earn the remaining 35% of the income of that country. That statement in itself was a huge eye-opener, which testifies to the perception that we already have in our mind, but shows us how deep and how severe the situation in South Africa actually is. I think that South Africa is the most inequitable country in the whole world when it comes to the socioeconomic gap between the wealthy and the impoverished. I can stand to be corrected, but I think that they are the forerunners in that category. And I know that the country is deeply plagued by poverty, but I did not realize the extent to it, that almost 50% of the adult population in South Africa is living below the poverty line of $70 per month. So just using those stats, it's quite obvious and saddening, deeply saddening, that our country is deeply plagued with poverty and inequality, which are very closely linked.
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit in the previous question. Unfortunately, in South Africa, a lot of the inequality is related to financial opportunity and to a huge disparity in the financial status of different segments of the population. And naturally, if one is speaking about poverty being about not being able to afford the basic amenities of life, then absolutely income has an impact on that. So, for example, people in our society who historically did not have access to proper jobs, or historically were not properly educated, or not brought into the mainstream of society, have traditionally earned much lower than better educated people, or people who had job security, or people for whom opportunities were easier. And that the difference in income has meant huge differences in society, where some people are still caught in a poverty trap, even 25 years later, after democracy and things have changed in South Africa. That poverty trap takes generations to resolve.
What would you say are the reasons behind the widening wealth gap between the rich and the poor in South Africa?
I think it stems from apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
If there wasn't apartheid, they wouldn't have this extreme wealth gap. I mean, you look at what's 10% of the world of the country's population owns 90% of the land, and during apartheid, 90% of the country's wealth went to 10% or 5% of the population. So it started from there, and to try and get it back to some sort of equilibrium is very, very difficult without hurting the people that had more previously. I don't think the government want to do that. That's why they haven't been. That's why when you look at the wealth redistribution and the land redistribution that should have happened after 1994, it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Because we also want peace, but it's a very fine line to try and get everything. But yeah, so it was apartheid, and now increasingly it's got a lot to do with corruption, the way the economy is suffering in South Africa right now. The epidemic or the pandemic is taken over South Africa, so it's really, very difficult. I mean, I think it was yesterday that they found the new unemployment stats came out, and it was 30.8% of all people that could work is not working. It's just because there's no jobs, and there's no jobs because the economy is suffering. The economy is suffering because there's a lot of corruption, and the corruption is there because I think everything stems from apartheid.
Well, yeah, education and access to basic, your basic needs in life. So a lot of the African population live on farms. There's no access to water, which, like in Malaysia, with the rain, you get water all the time, sometimes too much water. But in South Africa, when you live on a hill over the hill and far away, there's no basic water. So some people are walking 20 kilometers to get their daily pint of water. So access to water, access to sanitation. We can go to the bathroom and our wastewater gets flushed away. They're living in their wastewater, which is not a healthy environment. Access to a good health system, which in South Africa is free, but it's not a good system. It needs definitely work on it. Basic food. People need access to basic food, and if you put all of those together, it makes for a lot of factors have to be aligned for people to actually rise out of their poverty.
I think there are many things that could that all together. It's a multifaceted answer. So there's many things that together compounded this issue in South Africa, but that would take a long discussion. I think if we have to pinpoint a few major factors, we can in this short talk. And South Africa, well, you're doing your assignment on South Africa, so you must know that South Africa emerged from an apartheid state. Initially, before the apartheid state, they were colonialists of the British Empire, and then they were subject to apartheid by Dutch settlers that had remained behind after the British had left. And those Dutch settlers implemented a discriminatory racial system called apartheid, where they severely oppressed the native Black population. Financially, in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of any social aspects, in terms of not being able, restricting them in almost every way possible.
A lot of things. It doesn't help that the global economy has undergone such enormous crises in the last 10 to 15 years. We had the global financial economic crisis in 2008. In 2020, we are all, the whole world has been caught up in the COVID-19 pandemic. So all of what happens in the global economy has an impact on individual economies. And so there are a number of factors which have impacted on the widening gap between those that have and those that don't have. And there are various schools of thought as to what has contributed to that. So some scholars and some economists will say globalization, for example, has had a negative impact on a country like South Africa because we've imported much more than we have exported, and that has resulted in a difference in our balance of trade. And for that reason, we're having to spend more money than we receive in foreign currencies, which has an impact on how we grow as an economy. So there's one argument for that. And the people who argue against globalization say that it's always people who already have money that are able to make the money. So if you started off poor, you will still remain. You will get poorer. And there's this whole debate around whether globalization has been a good thing, and whether it's not actually compounded the problem of the widening gap between the rich and the poor. So I think South Africa is one of those middle income countries which has quite a unique, obviously a unique political background, but also had quite a complicated economic structure prior to 1994. And I think the unbundling or the deregulation of a number of our industries after that has had an impact on income inequality rather. And then going back to the huge disparities in education status of people in our country, again, I would go back to saying that the people who already are privileged, it's easier for them to access better education, better opportunities, etc., as opposed to people who are starting from a zero base. So it will take a while before people who are poor can actually bring themselves out of that poverty, if they ever can, through education. And that takes a while. Also, the world has moved on since 1994. Jobs are scarcer, things are more automated. The world has moved in a different direction. So, for a country like South Africa, where a lot of people are lesser educated or don't have the necessary skills that are needed in today's kind of industries, it is extremely difficult to accommodate those people in a fast moving economy. And I think that is also added to poverty levels and the widening gap between people who have first world income and those that don't. So I'll give you an example. A person with an IT qualification in South Africa or an accountant in South Africa have enormous advantage vis-a-vis a person who's maybe just finished 8th grade and whose only real skill is perhaps blue collar work or unskilled labor, if one can call it. There's a reason for that. Economies don't necessarily need those skills or don't value those skills as highly as they would a more educated and a more skilled person.
What is your take on the living standards of the South African people?
Again, there's some very, very rich people, some very, very poor people. And I think if you compare it to other countries, even in Malaysia, if you pick the poorest person in Malaysia, they'll still be helped by the government. You'd still get healthcare. You'd still get, you wouldn't go hungry if you didn't need to go hungry, in Malaysia. But in South Africa, it's very different. Their homelessness, hunger. I mean, people don't just live from day to day. They live from meal to meal. They're not sure where they're going to get the next meal from. So the question again was, I'm getting mixed up here.
What is your take on the living standards of South African people?
The living standards. So yes, so the poorest is terrible. I mean, where I used to live in South Africa, I lived in a nice house, double garage, driveway, nice big yard. But literally 3 kilometers from where I lived was a township not even a township, an informal settlement, where there were houses made out of mud with no electricity, no running water, with no sanitation facilities. So there's a huge difference when it comes to how people live in South Africa. Because the class divide is so big, you'll see a lot of different living standards.
I think the rich have it too good and the poor have it very bad. Mm-hmm. There's such a big disparity between the two, because I can go home and say life is good for me. Mm-hmm. But people, who are living not even 5 kilometers from me are not having it that good because of their circumstances. And it is hard because you try to get involved to help people's lives. But how can I say? You have to also want to lift yourself out of that poverty. Yeah. So it's quite hard to to do that. And the thing is, unless, like, you go to school, you go to university, you are taught to use your brain to want more out of life. But when you've never been taught that, it's very hard to expect more than your hut on the hill over far away. As I said earlier, it's so hard for me to say all these things because, I mean, South Africa for me is home and I absolutely love it. But we haven't lived there on a day-to-day basis for 10 years. So things hopefully are changing. You know, South Africa has one of the most modern human rights charters in the world, because it was only made 25, 30 years ago by Nelson Mandela in 1994. But in so many other ways, we are so far behind in economy and industry and commerce throughout the world. But we have a human rights charter that is fantastic. You just need the rest of the country to build itself up.
Okay. What is your take on the living standards of the South African people?
I think I did touch on it earlier, and in my opinion, it is extremely low. I've been to a few places around the world, and in comparison to South Africa, the living standard of the masses is extremely low. A majority of the population still live in very rural, undeveloped areas. I'm talking about still living in mud huts with grass roofs. Children are still in classes that are outside under trees. They haven't been given proper schools yet. And those masses who have done the exodus to the city to find work, they can't even find proper shelter in the city. They end up, you know, squatting on vacant land that they find. They build, we call them jondals in South Africa. These are basically squatter camps. They are little rooms made of whatever rubble they can find, and they live in there. There's no sanitation, no water, no electricity, nothing. And they use that to do the menial work that they're able to find in the cities as domestic workers or as laborers in factories, or, you know, people who sweep the street. So it's the standards of living in South Africa for the poor are very, very bad, especially those who are living in squatter camp areas. But as I said, there is obviously a different classes of people. So you have the middle class who are being affected, that their earning power has been affected on a day-to-day basis. And their standard of living, in my opinion, is diminishing gradually, because their earning power is not increasing, but the expenses and their basic standard of living, those costs are increasing. So we're getting to a stage where they're not going to be able to maintain their current standard of living, and they will not be considered to be impoverished, but they will be considered to be living below their standard of living line. Then you obviously get the rich, who are the ones living in the condos and the large houses in the really fancy suburbs. And those fancy suburbs are no different to the fancy suburbs that you would get in another first world country, like America or England. And the amenities that are provided for them are also quite great. So if you want to know about the majority of the standard of living in South Africa, it's very bad, and in my opinion, it's very low.
Yeah, you know, this is quite a subjective one, and it's obviously there's objective data, and there's objective surveys that come out every year about living standards in different countries, and you can look at the World Economic Forum on this in terms of how we've ranked and how our ranking has changed through the years. From a subjective perspective, and it's purely anecdotal, it's subjective, it's not based on data, what I'm telling you now, and you're welcome to look at the data to get an objective view. You know, I think I was enormously privileged to have grown up in a middle class income home in the 1980s and 90s, and we enjoyed a relatively high standard of living. Our family did, and our home, and the rest of the community where I came from, the vast majority. If I look at it now, 25 years later, or 30 years later, I'd say that in general, living standards for that segment of people has maybe gone down, whereas on the other hand, living standards has gone up for a lot of people in South Africa who were extremely poor prior to 1994, but who since 94 have perhaps had a little bit of a better job, or had electricity, or had water in their houses, which they didn't have before. So for many, many people, the living standards have improved. For people who were in a middle class income, or from a middle class economic background, I'd say living standards have maybe not improved, they've maybe gone down. And then, of course, for the extremely wealthy, it doesn't matter. They had money. They always will have money, and so the question depends on who you ask and who you're asking about. For the very, very poor, they might tell you that things have improved. For the middle class, I think you might find that the answer varies, and people might say,
Have you
it's even
contributed
gone
to
down.
lifting people out of these circumstances during poverty? If so, how?
I mean, you try as much as you can, but I mean, yeah, I used to volunteer when I was in South Africa in charitable organizations. I think there was one friend of mine, became my friend. He's homeless, and he was disabled, and he didn't know what to do. He just lived his life on the street that way. Until I think a friend and I, we took him to Home Affairs, took him to the health departments. It took months and months and months, but eventually we got him to get his disability grant. He was able to move back to his village because he felt like he could contribute to his sister's household now with that money. Yeah, so you try to do small things, but there's so many people that need help that it's difficult to make a big mark.
I would say, because I live in Malaysia, when I'm in South Africa, I help South Africa. When I'm in Malaysia, I'm helping Malaysians, refugees here. But there is an organization in South Africa called I'm Staying. It's just started last year, and it's a very positive organization, really for the upliftment of people. Like, it started during the beginning of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could give money to I'm Staying, and they sent a food voucher on a phone. They have this new system. So these people who were living over the hill and far away, if they had a food voucher on their phone, they could go to like Tesco's or one of the supermarkets and buy basic food. They had to apply for it. And so I just felt that I like to give somewhere where I know that the money is being well spent.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an organization that I've really supported. Even being here, I still send money back to it in South Africa. And then even when we were living in South Africa, I have a lady who runs an orphanage up in the mountains, and we would help her twice a year with clothes and winter clothes and toiletries and things like that for her children. She had about 40 or 50 children. You can never help everybody, but you hope that by helping even one person or a few people, you're making a difference. But you can never say, well, I can help everyone in South Africa. It's just, it's like you can't help everyone in Malaysia, but maybe what you do makes a little bit of difference somewhere.
So I wish that I could do much more. I have done a few things in my minimal capacity. I feel everybody gets inundated with their own lives, and they forget about giving back. In my little way, in my way, we also try to do a lot of charity, providing like a meal every second week to cooking a huge meal and distributing the food to areas where people are living in these water camps. So that's one example. Another example is on a weekly basis, contributing to a family fund which provides bread to the orphanages where kids, obviously are living in under very low conditions, with the hope that they will grow up, be provided with with a few basic necessities, that they would grow up to value education and improve themselves, and then come and give back to the community again, so that we grow and not stagnate.
Well, I think every South African is faced with poverty on a daily basis. Every South African sees it all around them, from the people on the streets who are homeless, from people at every single traffic light who are begging for food or begging for money, from going to the supermarkets or the restaurants where on a daily basis people will come up and not have money for food. We're all impacted by it, and we all deal with it. It's part of our lives. We see it all around us. We move from one city to another, and we can see the enormous amount of poor people, shanty towns, things like that. So it is all around us. You can't avoid it, and you can't live in a bubble. Yes, I think we all try to do what we can. Donations, helping out at charitable institutions. I was fortunate enough to work for the South African government, and just in my work, we were able to, work on policies aimed at trying to improve business opportunities for poor people, for small businesses, for things like that. So we all do whatever we can in our own small way. But there's a lot of grassroots work that is happening in South Africa, not by government, by non-governmental organizations, by private citizens, etc., to try and help poor people.
Lastly, what change do you think or would suggest to improving the lives of the unfortunate who experience income inequality and are experiencing living in low living standards?
I think there should be a redistribution of wealth, definitely. A country like South Africa, and when you look at South Africa, it at one point mined 56% of the world's diamonds, 60% of the world's diamonds, 56% of the world's gold, 80% of the world's platinum, apart from all the other natural resources that we have. We should be a rich country, we should, but we aren't, because it's been taken away. I mean, even now, one of the biggest companies in the world when it comes to jewelry and diamonds is a company from England, or based in England, called De Beers. And De Beers is a South African company, or the mines are in South Africa. England, the UK, is the biggest distributor of gold in the world, but they don't mine a single ounce of gold in England. All the wealth that South Africa has, and it has a lot, it's abundant when it comes to wealth. Or its resources, I lie, not wealth, it's resources. But it's been taken away. I think it needs to be given back to the people. And I think there needs to be more of an equality when it comes to how everything is distributed. I think South Africa is one country where there should be some sort of socialist state, because the people need it. The people need to feel as if they're being taken care of, or at least thought about by the government.
Education. It's my standpoint. Make everyone go to school. Give them the ability to go to school. So it's not, you can't just say you have to go to school, because you have to say, how do you get to school? Are you being fed that you can come to school, knowing that you're not going to sit in the classroom all day because your stomach is hungry? Make sure that these children are getting a meal at school. How are they getting home? Have they got the ability when they get home to do their homework or their preparation? But for me, education is, I will support anything with education. That's my sort of drive, really. So I think if you can provide a better education, and unfortunately, South Africa have in so many ways lowered their standards. So they have lowered their pass rate on some exams to 30%. That's not a pass. That just means you pitched up and did a few lessons. For me, you've got to have 50% pass, so that at least it knows what you're talking about. We shouldn't lower our standards there to to try and make everybody pass. You've got to set everybody a higher standard so that you are achieving all the time. But for me, definitely education is the way forward, and I would hope that the government back that in some way to make sure everybody has a, they say everybody has a right to education, but some of these classrooms have got 40, 50 children in them. How do you teach 50 children at a time? I don't know. Teaching 2 children at a time is hard enough, let alone 50. So, but for me, education would be the factor, yeah.
It's education. At the end of the day, it all comes down to education, in my opinion. These things that I spoke about now about BEE and SMEs is addressing the currently unemployed adult population of the masses. But you cannot do that in isolation and forget about the youth who require the education. The education is the only thing that will take these youth when they become adults and give them the ability to prosper and to be successful in life and eradicate poverty in their life as individuals. And the only way that can happen, the big obstacles to education, especially in the Black masses of South Africa, is that they don't have the benefits. They don't have the basic shelter. They don't have the basic food that they need to even eat. So the kids are out there trying to beg on the streets and try to look for odd jobs here and there so they can get a little money, inconsistent money, but something so that they can get that plate of food at the end of the day. If those things, those basic necessities can be provided for these children so that they can have a peace of mind to actually focus on their education and complete it at a time that they are required to, that will help our country eventually get out of this deep hole that they're in terms of inequality and poverty. And that's not being done at the moment. There are many children that are not in school, that drop out of school, that are enrolled in school but don't even attend school, that attend school are so hungry they can't even pay attention in school. So that is something that I think needs to be addressed urgently. And if that's not addressed, the country, in terms of moving forward and growing, the chances look very bleak.
I think that's a very important question, and it's one my answer would remain the same to anybody who asks me this, is education. The key to uplifting people out of their their misery and their poverty is to get people educated, but decent quality education that really gives them skills that they can take out into the world and into the economy. So when we say education, when I say education, I mean a quality education, and for people to be given that opportunity and access to a decent education.